Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 70 and audio season 3, episode 35 of Music is Not a Genre. Each week I take a release or several from my collection. I discuss them, I give you my take on them, I throw in some interesting tidbits and facts and a lot of opinions, and I connect them to my music, other music, and other things in the world. Please take a moment if you are on YouTube and watching this to subscribe and hit the bell so you will be notified every time I upload a new video. If you are listening on audio, please go and check my page on anchor.fm/Nick-DiMatteo. You can find all of the podcasts there and some more information, and gives you an opportunity to donate too. If you would like to do that, I would very much appreciate that. And or anybody listening or watching, please go over to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, and you can support the podcast and my live performances and other things there. This week, the topic is the Foo Fighters, drummers who rule once they get off the throne. So every band member has their role, right? I'm actually in the middle of putting together and rehearsing a band for a gig for my band Rec in a couple of weeks as of the taping of this. And part of the job there as a band leader is to know who's doing what. Some things are pretty obvious. You're playing bass, you're playing guitar, keyboards, vocals, maybe a little less obvious when it comes to backup vocals, things like that, who does what. But there are bands who have members whose roles have fluctuated. They've changed over the years, or people who made decisions to make changes. And that's sort of what this is about, among other things, as well as it being about the awesome band, the freaking Foo Fighters. And we're going to get into all of that, trust me. But as I said in the title, we're going to focus on drummers. And if you know the Foos, you know the reason there. It's obvious. When you think of a drummer for a band, rock band, even a jazz band, just like a band drummer, you think of them on their throne, which is what they often call the seat that they sit on, behind the kit, just holding down the rhythm and the structure, adding dynamics and energy. Such a difference between live drumming and recorded drumming. They may do the rare backup vocal, or more backup vocals, or even an even rarer lead vocal. But 95% of drummers, according to my organization, the Guesstimators, just drum. They just drum and throw in, like I said, a few vocals here and there. They sit on their throne behind the kit and don't come out unless they're taking a bow or they're leaving the stage. Or they're trashing the kit for fun. But what about the other 5% that the Guesstimators say are different from those normal drummers, the regular drummers? That's kind of what we're talking about here. There are drummers who do more than drum on a regular basis. And I'm kind of breaking these down into categories. So you have that first category, which is drummers who drum, and that's pretty much all they do. Right? And there's too many to name there. Then you have the drummer who does a lot of backup vocals and the occasional lead vocal, maybe even one on every album, or something close to that, such as Roger Taylor of Queen, Peter Criss of Kiss, Grant Hart of Husker Du, even Foo Fighters' Taylor Hawkins, who does backups and the occasional lead. You have and I'm going to count temporarily Ringo in that, because when he was with the Beatles, that's what he did. Always had a song in every album, that kind of thing. But you'll see why I mention him again later. Then you have drummers who sang lead from the start. You have people like Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five, was the drummer and the lead singer. Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees was one of the main lead singers, Last Train to Clarksville, and so many of their hits. Lee Von Helm of the band did quite a bit of the lead singing as well as the drumming. Sheila E., it's too much to say about her, just absolutely amazing. Anderson .Paak, a guy I really respect because you don't see this often. Drummers who stay behind the kit and sing lead at the same time, in the modern era especially. So a lot of respect there. You have then the people who do everything or did everything or can do everything or to choose to do whatever they want to do on any recording and sometimes live as well, but in particular on recordings such as Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Todd Rundgren, who did a lot of his own instruments, and Prince, who did everything. Then another category, you have lead singers, because this is what we're talking about here, drummers who rule once they get off the throne. So we're talking about the transition between drumming and leading. And you have those lead singers who are drummers. They drum, they know how to drum, they have drummed before, but transitioned from drumming either very early on or never really did drum in the bands that they were in that made them famous. For example, Rick Astley, learned recently he's actually a great drummer. Everybody knows him for his vocals and for, he plays the guitar and stuff like that. Chris Cornell, Soundgarden, actually started as the drummer before realizing he needed to be up front. But that was very, very early on. And then Jack White. He is, Meg White was the drummer for the White Stripes, but Jack White's a drummer as well. I'm sure he did some of the drumming in some of the recordings or on some other thing. But from the beginning of the White Stripes, we know him as the guy up front playing the guitar, and singing. Now, that brings us to the category that we're actually talking about this week. And for those of you counting at home, tell me how many categories that was, because I forget. And I have it written down here. See, those of you watching, this is my notes. I still forget. The category is, again, those drummers who transition from just being a drummer, occasional lead, some backups, to being the total, not just lead singer, but the total leader of the band. You have, I think, probably the pinnacle. I'm going to say the pinnacle is Phil Collins, who took over for Peter Gabriel once he left Genesis and continued to drum there, but eventually transitioned to being the leader and lead singer, and certainly of his solo career. Karen Carpenter, great drummer. I didn't know that. I found that out. That's what research does. She is known for having a beautiful voice, and for her brother, backing her up, and the two of them, their voices meshing so well together. Not as well known was that her brother had a jazz band before they, did what they did that made them famous, and she was the drummer for that band. Don Henley of the Eagles. I don't know much about the Eagles. I never really delved into them. But the older I get, the more you learn and all that stuff. I didn't know he was the drummer for the Eagles. I knew him as a lead singer. I knew him as, I know his voice. I can hear his voice in my head, especially for some of his, solo stuff. Did he sing End of the Innocents? I believe. All from the 80s and stuff like that. He certainly transitioned from being kind of just the drummer with the occasional vocal here and there to growing to the point where he was doing more leads and then just leading. Ringo, I'm mentioning him twice because he had, those two phases of the career of the people in the Beatles. He eventually, and I saw him live, and yeah, he went back on the drums for a couple songs, but no, he not only does he lead his all-star band and has for 30-some years, he is the lead singer and prefers to stay up there dancing, singing, doing his thing, and like I said, occasionally going back to the drums. That is a transition. That's a transition. And, oh, am I forgetting somebody? Oh, yeah, Dave Grohl. The whole reason I made all this stuff up, put it all together, let's say. I didn't make it up. Or did I? Dave Grohl, if you know him, then, I won't say then you know this, because I know somebody who knows the Foo Fighters, who knew Dave Grohl's name, didn't know his history. Just it was maybe an age thing. So I will say, for those of you who do or don't know, Dave Grohl was the drummer for Nirvana, not their original drummer, but the drummer that took them, to where they went. Had a history in the DC punk scene, hardcore punk. Prior to that, before working through however he did some tours even before joining Nirvana. However it is they hooked up, they got famous in 1994. Kurt Cobain kills himself. The whole thing implodes. What we may not have known at the time is that Dave Grohl had already been writing songs and recording some demos and things that he passed around to people. I forget the name of the kind of the band that he sort of made up while he was in Nirvana, and I think he released something in '92. And he did sing, I think, on a track or two, or maybe one lead track on a Nirvana album. But other than that, as we know, he did drumming, some of the most powerful drumming in history, and intricate as well, and backup vocals, Then Nirvana is over. He has all these offers from other bands, including Pearl Jam, but knows that what he wants to do, what he needs to do, is create his own music and to kind of lead that charge. So he, and I believe it was initially as a joke, came up with the name Foo Fighters, which comes from, I think, some World War II military term about UFOs. And that's why those of you can see I'm holding up their first album, because I'm talking about it now. It's called Foo Fighters, eponymous, and it has like a laser gun on the front. And that was a reference to the kind of alien thing. But just made it up as a joke. He's even quoted as saying if he had any idea this would have become successful and last as long as it did, he would have picked a different name. Which is kind of funny because I love the name, and I'm sure a lot of other people do. He went into the studio and recorded like 99.5% of that first album himself, all of the instruments, wrote the songs. Greg Dully from Afghan Wigs, I believe, contributed guitar on something, but otherwise it was him. It was all Dave Grohl. We maybe throw him at that point in his career in that category of the people who did everything, like McCartney and Stevie Wonder, Tom Rundgren, and Prince, and so many others. I know these are short lists that are incomplete. But realized he wanted to take it further. He passed it around. People say, hey, it's good, and put a band together to tour. And that was the beginning of his transition from an amazing drummer who could have gone down in history already without having done a single other thing, to forming and leading a brand new band that has now itself made history. They are now their own legends. They are, I would say, currently one of the main standard bearers of rock, of hard rock, and they're kind of almost ambassadors to that by virtue of some of the activities they've had, especially in the last 5 years, which we'll get to. I'm going to kind of go somewhat in chronological order here. But man, let's think about 1994 for a second. If you were old enough to have lived through that period and remember it, and were especially a fan of Nirvana and grunge, to have had that tragedy happen and to have seen grunge start to transition out of itself and either become kind of that, co-opted version of grunge, which had a bit of a sheen to it that wasn't as, in some ways authentic, although I always dispute what that word means, or transitioning so far out of grunge that you get the kind of records that, Pearl Jam started to make in their, post-grunge period, let's say, a little rootsier and things like that, more exploration and all of that, bands who grow, even Stone Temple Pilots I mentioned in a different podcast, the bands who grow out of that. What was going to happen to that kind of aggressive, crunchy sound that Nirvana just blasted into the universe, maybe didn't invent, but certainly, codified it in some ways and made it popular, in a way that was still organic and dynamic on its own? Dave Grohl answered that. that first Foo Fighters album with, I mean, when I heard the song "I'll Stick Around" with that pretty rapid guitar riff, chordal guitar riff, it just blew my face off. It felt to me like a continuation of the kind of music that the Nirvana might have made through one strain, through like a Smells Like Teen Spirit strain, had they continued. I know that Kurt Cobain had talked about being fans of REM and the Monkees and wanting to go in a more pop direction, and there might have been more influence from the way they did things unplugged and a little more range as far as dynamics and things like that. Yes, but they likely also would have done some super hard stuff and aggressive stuff, and that's where that early Foo Fighters stuff came in. And I was thrilled. I was at a time, as I said before, when grunge was phasing out in some ways, and when Kurt Cobain had killed himself, and so many other things were happening to kind of mark the end of a very short era, to have Dave Grohl and the Foo Fighters come out of the gate with that album with as much passion and power as they did, and craft, songwriting craft. They took grunge, added some earlier rock influences, hard rock and metal, but in particular hard rock, and most importantly for me anyway, power pop, because the songwriting was incredible from the get-go as well. What a thrill. What a cathartic thrill to have that album take hold the way it did at a time in a similar way to when the Hole album came out, Courtney Love's band, Hole. That was itself a triumph, and I'm going to get to that in a future podcast. But that same idea of from the ashes of tragedy, Phoenix rises. Can't believe I said that. And out comes bands who were related to that, who have this passion that just needs to be expressed and kind of exploded into the world. And great, right? So that's great. Could have made that one album and we would have said, oh, awesome, good follow-up. But then another album comes along. For those of you who can't see, I'm now holding up their second album, The Color and the Shape, one of my favorite covers of any album. It's got some science in there, I assume. I don't know what that is, frankly. And the hits from that album were even bigger. I mean, I know Monkey Wrench, but My Hero, that's probably and Everlong, My Hero and Everlong. So that second album was like no sophomore slump there, sophomore, triumph, and shows that maybe we didn't know yet that they had staying power, but they had they had the substance, they had the ability to put out more than one album of good music. And I say they at this point because he had formed a band, a couple members of Sunny Day Real Estate, which had recently broken up, and I think Pat Smear was in at the time. And quick word about Pat Smear, if you don't know him, he's a little older than people from that era because he has a history from the late 70s of being in a punk band called The Germs. Seminal punk band. So for him to have been a part of Nirvana and the Foo Fighters must have been an honor for them, and is an honor for them. But it's pretty awesome for him too, because he's a guy who deserves the credit for being in that original band and deserves the career that he has had. So just a quick word there. And yeah, so what the Foo Fighters then continued to do over these 25 plus years. Their 25th anniversary tour was canceled last year. Now it's like the 26th anniversary, whatever. Because he didn't quite have a band when the first album came out. So I guess that's why they're calling it that. Is put out albums that have always had at least one hit, have had tremendous amount of substance, have explored and grown and expanded their sound while still keeping that kind of core hard rock, power pop sound with still hints of grunge even to this day. And you get to that, what happened with me was I thought, The Color and the Shape was when I started to get even a little more excited because, again, I thought, geez, they're going to stick around. Like their first hit, I'll stick around. And but who, but I didn't. I was like, they can't possibly, they're just going to stick with that kind of sound or what have you. And then I'm reaching over here, people, for the listeners out there, the one with the tattoo on the back of his neck of FF, the Foo Fighters, when they develop that F, that kind of font, there is nothing left to lose. And you have the song Learn to Fly. And it's a great album. I remember loving this album in the car and the CD player. But in particular, I'm putting this down so I don't knock things down here. When Learn to Fly took things to a whole other level, And then you have, let's just keep going, right? One by One was, again, I thought, well, I like that album. There's Nothing Left to Lose. But it had changed the sound to some degree. And I thought, where are they going to go? Their first song, the opening track off of One by One, All My Life. If you've heard it, you're hearing it in your head right now. If you know that song, you're hearing it in your head right now. Times Like These, which he has, Dave Grohl and Nirvana have revived a lot lately because of the current times. And I'm not naming every single hit from every single album. The ones that I remember the most and the ones that really said to me, there's so much here. There's so much. And it was really those third and fourth albums that said to me, they're not going away, or I hope they don't go away. I hope they continue to develop the way they have developed. And at this point, for years, now, at that point, their drummer was Taylor Hawkins, who I mentioned briefly earlier. And this is the thing about Taylor Hawkins. So you have a guy, Dave Grohl, who at that point, even in the mid-90s, was one of the most famous drummers ever. If you knew anything about drumming and that kind of music, or even other kinds of music. Because Nirvana who they were, he himself had some legend status already at that young age, but also because one of the best drummers, I put him up there in a different sense with Jimmy Chamberlain of Smashing Pumpkins, and just that good of a drummer who wants to be up front. Imagine being the drummer who has to take his place. And I don't feel like there was a blink. You listen to the first album, you're like, amazing. And you listen to the next albums when Taylor Hawkins started doing, recording the drums and performing them live, and you didn't miss a step. And he's one of the members who's stuck around for this entire time, So for a guy he had to have such confidence and certainly skill and a backbone, but also I believe, and I can't verify this, but I know it's controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. It seems like Dave Grohl was kind of an awesome guy. Kind of the guy you would want to work with if you were a musician or in any other capacity, in that he knows what he wants, he's good at forming it and getting it and creating it, but he has tremendous respect for the people he works with. And so I think I don't know. I just watched this mini documentary that they put out a few months ago, and that's the sense. I've always gotten that sense. We'll talk a little more about why as I come up in the years. So coming up in the years, you have this album, In Your Honor, which is when they felt like, okay, these are like veterans now. Foo Fighters had kind of become veterans at this point, and I apologize, I don't recall what year this was out. But Best of You would be the big one, I think, from this, where you would, again, you're hearing it in your head. And it's a double album, too, which is, awesome. I like any band who at any point in their career says, I'm going to put out a double album. Because, these days it doesn't even make a difference because everybody streams everything. But, it's a bold statement to do a double album. And then you have Echoes, Silence, Patience, and Grace. And I will admit I don't have as much of a memory for this one, but I know that The Pretender was a hit, and they had a couple of Long Road to Ruin, I believe. And it was one of those where you could tell they were expanding and exploring and kind of looking for other things. And that continued, I believe, on Wasting Light in some, of a different way these days. And Rope, was another big one. And also, again, just kind of a very cool cover, the Kodachrome kind of cover. And you're looking, if you're watching the video, you see that's it. Those are the 8 albums, or was it 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 albums. But that's not it, because that was, my God, I think 10 years ago when Wasting Light came out. A few years later, they did this thing called Sonic Highways, from which an album came. And talk about exploration. They went around the country. They made an HBO show out of it. And in each city, they explored the history of music in that city and wrote and recorded a song in that city. And then you're kind of like, oh, there are ambitions well beyond the Foo Fighters here. There's somebody of just such a tremendous love of music that there needs to be more communication about it than what one band can do or wanted to do. And thus that TV show and the way they created that music. And then they went back and did more of a standard kind of Foo Fighters album, Concrete and Gold, on which I believe Justin Timberlake contributed some stuff. So again, trying to expand and look at more things they can do there. And I remember a video from that album that was kind of awesome. And I don't have these albums on CD because, as you know, if you've been listening to me, I stopped buying CDs about 10 years ago. So it doesn't mean I don't talk about the music beyond that, but that's why you're only seeing these 7 here. And I'm completing their discography verbally, because these are things I listen to on various streaming services. Then this year, or was it late last year? I don't remember. I think it was this year. They put out their recent album, Medicine at Midnight. And just when you thought, after something like, the stuff that they did in the early O's and Sonic Highways and doing that TV show, and they're doing, I think, podcasts, and there's a series he's doing, a kind of shedding light on certain other things, and just generally having fun and all that stuff. And you're like, okay, now they're just established rock veterans, and they're kind of easing into something. And then they put out this album, Medicine at Midnight, which adds so many other elements to it that the Foo Fighters didn't have, that you're like, oh, in some ways it's only the beginning. And sadly, I haven't seen them live yet. If anything's going to make me want to see them live, it's their recent album. And I always love it when a band who's been around a while continues to put out music that's as vibrant as any of the music they've ever done. It's not a retread. It's not just trying to please fans or check off some boxes on a list, but it's creating new music. The way U2 still does, and other bands like that who've been around quite a while. His daughter also sings on the album with him and sings live with him, which as a father I absolutely love. And quick mention, I talk about being an ambassador of the phenomenon of Nandi Bushell, that British girl, I think is still only 10 years old, who's an amazing drummer herself, and did this kind of challenge thing. What a family to grow up in, that there's such a musical family, and challenged, quote unquote, Dave Grohl to a drum off. And they, I'm not going to go through all of what happened there, but let's just say the main point here is that feeling of support and of extending the love of music, in that way and in that direction to someone 40 years, younger, is a testament, I think, to how great Dave Grohl is, not just as a drummer and a singer and a writer and a producer and all of that stuff, but as a person, and how important that he and the Foo Fighters have become in the legacy of music in general, and certainly have been an influence on the music that I have created. I mean, it took a while because I was doing something different back around that time. But, you know, when the color and the shape came out and I saw them, you know, spell color in the British way, I know that influenced the title of my band Rex album, Parts and Labor, because I spell labor Labour. One of the influences. I mentioned another one last week, but that's definitely one of the influences. And from that album, really, onward, that was the first album where you can hear a clear influence here. But from that album onward, there are at least a couple of tracks on each of the Rec albums that I've put out that have had a clear Foo Fighters influence. And the most recent one, hands down, because someone actually said, oh, this sounds like the Foo Fighters, even though, again, when you create, you don't always have another band in mind, but subconsciously it's in there, is the song Don't Say You Don't from Rec's album Synergy for the Weird. It's the most recent album that we've put out. You'll hear it. Please click on that and listen to it, and you'll hear the similarity there, because there's an energy that we share in a certain way, and like I said, huge influence. Were you a fan, or are you a fan of the Foo Fighters? Were you a fan of Nirvana? Do you remember that period in '94 when all this stuff was kind of slipping away in the early '90s and we were transitioning the mid '90s, and some bands kind of took charge, like the Foos, and brought us into the future in a certain way? Did you have any idea then that they'd be where they are now? I did not. I absolutely didn't. Did you? Yeah, that they have such staying power, that they're the standard bearers, the ambassadors, as much as they are. I want to know what you think, because comment whether you agree or disagree. My objectives here are always music, conversation, and connection. Thank you so much for listening, for watching, for reading, for clicking the links, for reading again, for listening again, especially to Rex music, to my music, for sharing. Anybody you know who's a fan of any of the bands that I profile, any of the music I profile, please pass on these videos, for supporting, for subscribing, for donating, for being a Patreon patron, and just for being here. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time.